welcome to the last in our wellbeing series. Over the last 6 weeks, we've looked at several elements to improve our emotional well-being, from the neuroscience of thinking and feeling to developing our own emotional literacy and agility, right the way through to how to manage overwhelm. But the whole purpose of the series really is to improve our well-being so that we can feel happier. And one of the key pillars to improving our emotional well-being is to develop self-compassion. So I'm going to talk a little bit about self-compassion today and what it is and how we can get it. But I want to start off with understanding about our self-esteem, because this helps us really to understand why self-compassion is so important. Now, we've all been told that high self-esteem is a great thing. You know, high self-esteem has led to research on people being happier, more confident, more capable, and achieving more in life. So it's something that we all aspire to do. And also, inversely, low self-esteem, increases depression. People that with low self-esteem have anxiety. So really, we don't want to feel low self-esteem. We want to feel high self-esteem. And I'm not saying that high self-esteem isn't bad for us, but what I want to talk about is the way we get there, the challenge of getting to have high self-esteem, to feel more confident about ourselves. And one of the biggest challenges with high self-esteem is that really, in order to have high self-esteem, we have to be above average. Nobody likes to be called average. So to have high self-esteem, we've got to be above average. But as the law of averages go, not everyone can be above average. Mathematically, it's impossible. So there's an issue there with trying to get high self-esteem. It's the way we get high self-esteem that's a bit of a challenge, because in doing so, what we're doing is comparing ourselves to others and placing people beneath us in order that we can feel better. And you often see this in schools in terms of bullying. People that bully have actually low self-esteem, but what they're trying to do is they're trying to improve their self-esteem by making other people feel lesser than them, by putting other people down. And so this is some of the negative connotations that are associated with getting to that point of high self-esteem and the comparison that we do with others. Have I got this? If I've got that, then I'll feel better. And the other challenge with high self-esteem is, even when you've got high self-esteem, it's a very fragile state to be in, because whenever we're faced with a challenge, if we're faced with a difficulty in life, something where we fail at something, our high self-esteem can drop instantly. A bit like eating too many sweets, feeling good, and then that sugar crash afterwards. So high self-esteem is great, but there's another way of developing our self-esteem so that we feel good and we feel happy. And that is the practice of self-compassion. And there's a lot of research done into self-compassion, and the research I'm going to be mainly talking about today is by Kristin Neff, who works for Berkeley University in America. And some of the work she's going to be talking about I'm going to share. But some of the challenges around self-compassion are people's perception around self-compassion. Now, we all know compassion is really good. It's recognizing that you feel emotionally for somebody that's suffering and you want to help them. So compassion is really, really important and a lovely trait to have. It's a great quality to have. But when we hear self-compassion, the research from Berkeley shows that people see it as a bit soft, a bit self-indulgent, a bit self-centered, if you're being all lovely to yourself, and even selfish. So I want to take that away, because it's none of those things. It's just a different way of doing things. And in terms of that selfishness that sort of comes in, people feel that if we're kind to ourselves and are compassionate to ourselves, then we won't be motivated to move forward or to drive ourselves forward. Sometimes people feel we need to give ourselves a hard time by saying that's not good enough, you need to do better, and that's a driver. But actually, all of the studies recognise that those people, when they're self-compassionate, procrastinate less and are actually more motivated. And also it increases Happiness reduces anxiety and reduces stress. So the practice of self-compassion is really powerful in improving your emotional well-being. So let's look at how we can practice self-compassion and what it looks like. Kristin Neff identifies three key parts to it. So I'll go through them with you and then we'll share about how we can practice those. So number one is kindness, quite obviously. But it's the practice of self-kindness. And I'm going to take a lovely example for this. Say you've got a friend, a colleague who has done something really bad at work. They've failed, they've made a huge mistake, and they've come to you. And it's what kindness would you apply to them? And often in training, when I'm talking about this with people, they'll say, well, you know, I'll pull them up a seat, I'll make them a cup of tea, might give them a piece of cake, and I'll say things to them like, it's all right, everyone makes mistakes, you can fix this, it's only minor, it will be fine. And use words like that, really soothing words, and your really sort of calm voice, really empathetic listening. And then in our training, we often flip that round to say, well, what would happen if it wasn't your friend that made a huge mistake at work? What would happen if it was you? What would you say to yourself? And quite interestingly, it's not a calm and soothing voice. It's quite irritated, and it's language like, oh, you're stupid. I can't believe you made such a mistake. You're useless. What were you thinking? So self-kindness is really about how we flip from that narrative, the negative narrative when we do something wrong, into the soothing, kind words that you would give to a friend. So it's about practicing when you've made a mistake, very quickly going, yep, I've made a mistake, but then practicing it will be okay. It's not that bad. You can do something about this, rather than engaging with that negative self-talk. So that's the first part of self-compassion, being kind to ourselves, using self-soothing language. Number two is recognizing our humanity. Quite often when we're faced with a really big challenge, one of the things we revert to is I language, and we internalize the situation. So say, for example, you failed an exam, it might be, I'm rubbish, I'm useless. But we tend to use that intrinsic language and isolate ourselves and get caught up in negativity, where we feel very alone and very helpless. And what humanity does is recognize that actually hardship and struggle is deeply embedded in the human condition, and we're not alone. So it's about connecting and broadening and looking beyond ourselves by being able to recognize that if we are feeling like we've done something wrong, like feeling that pain that we do when we're faced with hardship, that actually pain isn't just my feeling. Everybody experiences pain, and everybody will struggle at some point, and recognizing that it's a common theme that we have, and broadening our feelings so we don't feel so isolated. So instead of me and I language, we use we and us language. So if we failed an exam, instead of going I'm rubbish, going gosh, failing an exam is painful, it really hurts. Hundreds of thousands of people have failed exams. I'm not alone here. There must be a way through, because people survive the failing of an exam. So how can I manage that better? So we recognize the humanity rather than internalizing. And number three is the practice of being mindful. And I've talked about mindful throughout this series and mindfulness throughout these series. But it's really important just to slow your processing down and be much more conscious about your thought practice. In particular, for self-compassion, what we really need to do is just be mindful of that inner talk, that self-critic that happens whenever we are faced with a challenge or whenever we do something wrong. That we don't jump in with the I'm useless or I'm not good enough. That we're mindful enough to recognize that that is an inner critic, but it's not who you are and it's not who you have to be. There is a great activity you can do on identifying your inner critic, which is really, really useful, and I'd happily send that to you. I'll send my contact details at the end, but it's a really good way of understanding where that inner critic comes from. And when I've done the work with other people and myself, it's been really interesting. So my inner critic often comes up with the lovely words of you're not good enough, or internally, I'm not good enough. And it really helps to understand where that comes from. And what I understand about where my inner critic of I'm not good enough comes from is because ultimately, deep down, I want to improve, I want to be better. So it's about being mindful of the language I'm using, recognizing it, understanding where it comes from, accepting that I will always have a bit of a self-critic, but being able to choose how I want to respond to that and what it actually means. So instead of the inner turmoil of, oh, you're not good enough, being able to say to myself, I know what you're saying. You want to get better at this. That's absolutely fine. I believe you can get better. What can we do now to improve? So it's being able to use your inner critic or your negative self-talk, but put it into something that's much more motivational than the shaming of yourself through negative self-talk. If you want to read a bit more about shame, Brené Brown is an absolute expert on that field, and it's written some amazing books, including Dare to Lead, which is really useful about managing those feelings and being able to be much more successful in identifying, recognizing and moving away from the negative self-talk and the shame feelings. So being much more mindful of what we say to ourselves and being able to move on from that is the third practice of self-compassion. So when we put all those three together, we have, first of all, we have that element of basically being much kinder to ourselves, the way we speak to ourselves, being much more soothing with our words as we would do our own best friend. Then we've got recognizing that we're not alone. Pain and suffering are part of being human, and that it's okay to feel that and to acknowledge that it is painful, but to recognize everybody feels that pain and that it's transient, it will move. And three, it's being mindful of what we say to ourselves, being aware of our inner critic, accepting that that's what it's going to say, but being able to understand it deeper and being able to move on from that self-critic rather than getting into some negative self-talk. So thinking of a different way to address your inner critic so you have much more positive outcomes. And when we do all those three together, we are much more compassionate, we are much more kind to ourselves, we're much more gentle, we give ourselves much more option. And in turn, all the research around self-compassion proves that those people that are self-compassionate are much more motivated, they're happier, they're less stressed, and they are much less anxious. So all those things to strive for in practicing self-compassion. And it is a practice. It's something that you need to be really aware of. If you want to explore becoming more self-compassionate or how you can manage any of the things I've talked about in my wellbeing series, you're welcome to contact me. My email address is leonie@thethinkingacademy.co.uk, or alternatively, you can contact me on my Twitter handle @thinkingacademy. That's the last in our wellbeing series, but if there are more topics that come up, I will add some additional sessions. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.